About a week ago, I was preparing to release my 6-month summary on the fighting in Ukraine. Surrounded by caveats and qualifications, I nervously put forward the idea that Ukraine might be capable of some limited offensives outside the Kherson sector before the end of 2022. The basic thesis was, despite heavy losses and a grinding fight in Kherson and the Donbas, the armed forces of Ukraine probably had enough fight left in them to launch at least a moderate, limited offensive somewhere else. Of course, just a few days before the video was due to go out, the armed forces of Ukraine decided to prove me very, very wrong. They could launch an offensive before the end of the year, but there would be very little limited about it. All of a sudden, trench fighting was out and blitzkrieg was back in fashion. After little more than a week of fighting, the Ukrainians had retaken thousands of square kilometres of territory. They had captured hundreds of abandoned Russian vehicles, and Zelensky had raised the Ukrainian flag in the former Russian stronghold of Izium. Certain Russian units ceased to exist almost entirely, and the offensive pushed all the way up to the Russian border in several places, all despite the fact that ostensibly at least Russia was meant to have air superiority over these areas. So as the Russians regroup on the east side of the Oskil River, we've got a few things to talk about, and some pretty obvious questions to answer. Namely, what on earth just happened? Why and how did it happen? And what's likely to happen now? And to answer that question, I'm going to try and do 3 things. The first is give a little bit of an overview. Look at how the armed forces of Ukraine went from an army that had its capital under siege only a little bit more than 6 months ago to one that was able to launch a successful combined arms offensive in the Kharkiv Oblast in this last week and a half. Then I'm going to look at the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives themselves, what happened in those offensives, and why do those offensives and their results matter? How do they shape the battlefield to come? And then leading on from that, what may come next in the context of the wider war? Now that's a pretty big ask, so as you can imagine, there are some caveats attached. We're going to be analysing something that is still ongoing. These offensives are still in progress, which means that the uncertainty is even higher than normal. I have been spending the last week trying to verify what I can, but ultimately a lot of this is pieced together from rumour, videos, and trying to dodge the various lies and propaganda pieces that are being released everywhere. So it's entirely likely that in years to come, some future historian is going to look at videos like this one and laugh at them. They will have access to Russian documents, Ukrainian documents, and more detailed information about what is actually going down. We don't, and we're going to make the best effort we can. So with all that said, there is tremendous uncertainty here. You've been warned. The other thing to say is I will not be going into close detail about individual military maneuvers or the movement of the map on day-to-day basis. That's not my area of expertise, and there are lots of other commentators that cover it. I'll link some useful videos in the description, such as the recent release by Colonel Reisner of the Austrian military covering the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives. Instead, I will be looking at this at a very zoomed out level. How do strategic inputs like manpower and resources shape battlefield outcomes, and how do recent battlefield outcomes shape those various inputs in turn and allow us to predict the course of the conflict going forward? Because on one hand, war can be a very personal thing, decided by bravery, skill, or tactics in the smallest, lowest level engagements. And on the other hand, it's a ruthless macroeconomic exercise about the resources involved and the willingness and capability of countries to turn those resources into combat power. Essentially, it can become war by the numbers. At a very zoomed out level, war can become a question of how many resources a country has available to it, how effectively or how willing it is to convert those resources into combat power, and how able it is to effectively apply that combat power in order to achieve battlefield and then strategic results. This sort of cold calculus can help explain why wars are sometimes punctuated by alternating periods of movement and attrition. A nation has a combat power advantage, so it is able to go on the attack. If that attack isn't enough to achieve a decisive strategic outcome and win a war, then eventually it is going to outrun its logistics and burn out its resources as a result of that offensive operation, assuming the situation isn't a complete overmatch, causing a situation to equalise and move into a more static attritional phase until one side once again, either through attrition or regeneration, gains enough of an advantage that it feels it can then launch a major offensive operation, and so the cycle goes on. It's a question of how quickly you can replace your losses. It is a question of how quickly you can build up your supplies, how quickly you can do the planning process, the intelligence gathering process, and bring together all of the facets necessary in order to make your units combat effective. Now, just a quick disclaimer so I don't get charged with heresy. Combat power is usually a defined term in most nations' manuals, and it has an agreed meaning and agreed components. I'm going to use the term, but I'm going to take it up a little bit of a level here because we're on YouTube and a more general discussion is helpful. I'm going to be talking about the big scale inputs into a nation's ability to wage war. Things like manpower, so your people, materiel, which is your stuff, morale, which is self-explanatory, intelligence method, and how you can combine all of that together into combat power, the ability of a nation to actually wage war on the battlefield. I apologise for anyone I offend, but talking about sustainment or protection individually is probably not particularly useful in a presentation like this one. And in order to understand how Ukraine got to the point where it had enough relative combat power to launch offensive operations against Russia, we need to go back to the battle for Kyiv. One way Russian propaganda has been trying to explain Russian reverses is by arguing that the Ukrainian army, pre-February 24th, was 100% populated with NATO-trained Terminators, the finest and most capable soldiers in Europe other than Russians. Indeed, some commentators try and take solace in the idea that they are, as they put it, fighting Russians. The reality is a lot of Western analysts weren't sure what the true combat potential of the Ukrainian army was. There were reasons to put really large error bars around any of those estimates. Not all of the army was NATO-trained. The army was very much in transition. Most of the equipment was not Western. In fact, barely any of it was. It was overwhelmingly post-Soviet equipment, which was essentially less modern in most cases than what Russia was using. And while the army and General Zaluzhny seemed to have been pretty confident that war with Russia was coming, the political leadership wasn't. Or at least, even if they did believe war was incoming, the president wasn't out there telling the population that conflict was imminent right down to the final days. So as far as many outside observers would have been concerned, Ukraine was a country with an outdated military, a divided political establishment, a government that didn't foresee a Russian invasion as particularly likely, and a country that continued to suffer from a significant degree of corruption and some degree of Russian political and economic infiltration. And that was reason enough for a lot of analysts in the West to put a big question mark over Ukraine's actual combat potential. There was a chance the whole system would come together in the event of a Russian invasion, but it wasn't seen as a sure thing. Unfortunately for the entire world, it seems Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin had decided that the Ukrainian system would indeed collapse if only he gave the door a firm kick. On the 24th of February, the Russian airborne blitzkrieg raced towards the Ukrainian capital, and the whole world was about to find out just how much combat power Ukraine actually had. Two big questions that many analysts had were about to be answered in dramatic fashion. The first question was simple enough. What was the morale factor? How hard would Ukrainian politicians and the Ukrainian people fight in order to resist a Russian offensive? I mean, in 2014, the Ukrainian army had melted away during the Crimean incursion. Volodymyr Zelensky was an unknown quantity. The guy is a former comedian, an actor, who was suddenly being put in the position of having to defend a country that was being attacked by an ostensible military superpower. How would he respond? The answer, of course, is history. The fight is here, I need ammunition, not a ride, may not be an exact quote, Zelensky may never have said it, but the sentiment is there. The political establishment stayed in Kyiv, even when the Russians got within a couple of kilometres of it. Ukrainian civilians greeted Russian tanks with Molotov cocktails. With each act of bravery and defiance, analysts were getting their answer. Ukraine was willing to fight. And it's hard to overestimate just how important this was. Ukraine had a deficit in material manpower. It had to be willing to convert more of what it had available, and its people had to be willing to endure more suffering than their Russian counterparts in order to make up for the asymmetry in other capabilities. Before February 24th, it was an open question whether or not that will was there. For me, as an observer, the answer was given the moment we started to see videos of people mixing Molotov cocktails in the public squares, or men in civilian clothing, grabbing what weapons they could and heading out into the forest to hunt Russian tanks. Those are not the actions of a people that were just willing to roll over. The second question was to do with the material component. Would Ukraine just run out of stuff? Even if it had the people and the will, if it ran out of weapons, then eventually Russia would be able to win by sheer attrition. This question would also be partially addressed in the opening weeks. Firstly, when the Western powers decided to surge an incredible number of anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons across the Ukrainian border. At one point, 17,000 anti-tank weapons made their way across the border in just 6 days. At the same time, Russian captured and abandoned equipment was brought into Ukrainian service at a massive rate. And so, once again, analysts could start to revise the estimates of Ukraine's combat potential upwards. For me, at least, the first week alone gave enough evidence to suggest that this fight was a lot closer than people in the media were suggesting at the time. If you look at those key inputs into national fighting power, you could see revisions across the place. In terms of manpower, it became clear that the Ukrainians were willing to volunteer and to mobilise at the same time as Russia had chosen a halfway measure based on a non-declaration of war and no general mobilisation. In terms of materiel, most of the Russian stuff turned out to be in worse condition and worse maintained than we expected, At the same time, Ukraine's expectations of resupply from the West probably had to be revised upwards. There were very few people that expected they would receive as many weapons as they did, as quickly as they did. Expectations of Russian competence in planning and execution also had to be revised down. The whole Thunder Run to Kyiv idea was stupid from its initiation, and the way it was executed left a lot to be desired. At the same time, we had clarification around Ukrainian morale, Russian morale, and also the asymmetry in intelligence. Russian missile strikes in the early days had failed to accurately locate and destroy the Ukrainian Air Force or the Ukrainian air defense system. That pointed to an intelligence failure. You bring all those factors together and it becomes clear that Russia didn't have the combat power to attack simultaneously in the south, in the Donbas and in the north, and in so doing overcome the city of Kyiv and overthrow the Ukrainian government. It simply didn't have the strength to do what it set out to do. But it was still the stronger of the two powers, which meant it retained the initiative. And having withdrawn from Kyiv, we got to see Russia launch a second series of offensives, this time a slow, grinding war in the Donbas. Nothing about the opening offensive on Kyiv was consistent with the way the Russians had trained to fight. It was a thunder run by light units towards a defended enemy position. There was minimal use of fires. No, instead this time, in the Donbas, things would be different. This time, Russia would leverage its artillery, its fires, in order to grind its opponent down and take strategic ground. It was going to be returned to the tactics of Grozny or the tactics of Syria. Bombardment, followed by probing assaults, followed by bombardment, followed by actual assaults. And if those failed, a return to bombardment and attrition until a further assault could be reached against yet more weakened positions. If you think about this from a resource perspective, it's basically the Russians saying they're willing to expend more ammo, more barrels, more material supply in order to inflict casualties and combat fatigue, manpower losses on the defending Ukrainian infantry. In key sectors, the Russians outgunned the Ukrainians perhaps 10-1 and were able to score a number of high-profile victories. Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are probably the two most famous. There were some warning signs on the Russian side that the Russians were exhausting their limited infantry forces in these artillery infantry assaults, but ground was being taken, and Ukrainian losses reached their highest point since the first days of the war. Those manpower losses started to put more and more of a premium on the race for mobilisation, and both nations took very different approaches to filling the ranks. Russia wasn't willing to hit the mobilisation button. It wasn't willing to pull Russians out of their peacetime jobs and force them into the army. Instead, it adopted a series of harsh measures. It brought in mercenaries and foreign volunteers. It called on its various federal subjects to form volunteer battalions by offering very large monetary sums for anyone who was willing to take up a short-term contract. It went to its training units in the army and it cannibalised them, ordering them to form more combat battalion tactical groups out of manpower that should have been used to train conscripts and new recruits. And it swept the so-called DPR and LPR clean of any manpower that could be found. And as a result, it would be residents of the Donbass that would actually bear a disproportionate share of Russian casualties in the fighting to come. Ukraine, meanwhile, had hit the general mobilisation button on day one, but was in fact having trouble absorbing all of the volunteer recruits that were turning up for service. Ukrainian casualties were mounting, to be sure, but the overall manpower trend was very heavily up, just given the sheer number of volunteers signing up for the territorial defence forces or being brought into the army. The bottlenecks instead were materiel and training time. The manpower was always going to be there, and as a result, the Ukrainians did over time find themselves in a position to be able to rotate units off the front line, to give them a break, and to put new units in their place. A luxury that wasn't always accorded to, for example, DPR and LPR units charged with holding the line. The simple reality then was that while Russia had probably had more combat manpower available on the eve of the invasion, the overall long-term trend was going to favour Ukraine. After all, young Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg weren't exactly racing to sign up by the tens of thousands. But manpower was only part of the equation. The Russians still had a massive advantage in materiel. Particularly, they had a very large advantage in fires. Shell rocket expenditure in the Donbas estimates for the Russians ranged from 6,000 to 70,000 rounds per day during the Donbas push. And that meant undergunned Ukrainian infantry defenders were often left to just take it, with very little artillery of their own to protect themselves. The introduction of some Western fire resources started to address this imbalance. It started with M777, and then Western self-propelled howitzers, and then finally the first HIMARS systems began to arrive, These could target Russian ammunition depots, command posts, coordination points, and other critical targets, and weaken the Russian advantage in fire. HIMARS would arrive shortly after the battle for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and after that point, the battle between Russian and Ukrainian forces in the Donbass was not quite as uneven as it had been before, because the Russian advantage in combat power in the Donbass, that composite between manpower, morale, materiel, intelligence, the gap between that and the Ukrainians was starting to narrow significantly. Remember, after the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, a lot of people were talking about how Bakhmut and Siversk, which are relatively close to there, would fall in short order, and how the real next stage was going to be the battle for places like Kramatorsk. The idea was essentially that the Russians would soon take all of the Donbass. Having taken all of Lugansk, they would now take all of Donetsk, and as a result, Russia would be able to declare victory on one of its major war goals, the liberation, so-called, of the Donbass. But the Russians didn't take Kramatorsk. They didn't take Bakhmut. They didn't even take Siversk after the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Instead, it seemed like every week the Russians would re-announce the taking of the small village of Pisky. Pro-Russian forces would first claim control of the village of Pisky on the 5th of August, which explains, logically, why they levelled it with thermobaric weapons on the 10th of August. 2 days after that bombardment, the Russians would claim that they controlled the situation in Pisky. And that statement was, of course, entirely consistent with the fact that 2 days later, everyone's favourite, Igor Konashenkov, was able to stand up and proudly declare that as a result of an offensive action, Russia had now liberated the village of Pisky. A statement which stood in some tension with the fact that there was visible fighting through the next week. Eventually, Pisky would fall, but nothing says that you are a superpower with a massive overmatch in terms of combat potential over your opponent than taking a month and a half to seize a village with a pre-invasion population of 6 people. Now, Pisky was fortified, true. It had defensive significance, true. But the amount of time and effort that the Russian forces had to expend in order to seize it threw up a little bit of a warning flare for some commentators. Pro-Russian commentators like Strelkov complained again and again that Russia was expending the last of its infantry reserves and its infantry proxies from the Donetsk and Lugansk republics against head-on attacks into the teeth of Ukrainian defences for relatively minor gains. And for those observing, it was battles like this that were a little bit of a clue that maybe the ratio of combat power in Ukraine was starting to level off, and maybe even shift in favour of the Ukrainian defenders. And so, with all of that context in place, it's finally time to talk about the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson. This is the southern offensive, towards the largest city in Ukraine that has been conquered by Russia so far. Now, as we all know in war, operational secrecy is paramount. Luckily for Ukraine, Russian intelligence doesn't seem to have been always on the ball. One clue, for example, that might have given the Russians the idea that maybe something was up at Kherson was the fact that just about every political figure in Ukraine was giving media interviews talking about the upcoming Kherson offensive and the need to reclaim the south. And just in case that wasn't subtle enough, eventually Zelensky stood up and did it himself. Those of you on YouTube would have been treated to weeks of Dennis telling us about the massive counterattack that was upcoming in the south, while Ukrainian government figures openly announced that such an offensive was coming. So that was clue 1 for Russian intelligence. Clue 2 was the fact that this was just an obvious place to launch an offensive. Kherson was a heck of a prize, the largest city that Ukraine had lost to the Russians, economically vital, dominating the southern part of the country, unlocking access to Crimea, all the while being relatively close to Ukraine's own supply lines and thus a reasonable target for a build-up to offensive action. So from a military logic perspective, it checked out. It was the obvious move on the board. But just in case the Russians still had any doubt, the Ukrainians started investing immense amounts of resources in shaping the battlefield in Kherson. What do I mean by that? I mean they started deploying HIMARS systems to do exactly the sort of things that you would do if you planned to attack an area. Guided rockets were expended to cut the Antonovsky Bridge and the various other logistical links joining Kherson to Russian supply lines on the other bank of the river. Over the course of several weeks, Ukraine would use its high-cost, high-valuable, rare Western munitions in order to cut Russian supply lines here, rather than deploying more of those valuable resources elsewhere. It appears that Russia detected what may have been the most heavily telegraphed offensive operation in human history, and as a result they heavily reinforced the Kherson region, including with a number of high-capability units, including members of the Russian airborne troops, the VDV. They established pontoon bridges and barges and brought what supplies they could across the river, bracing for a Ukrainian offensive. All the while we started seeing even more clues that something was indeed about to be up. Now this slide includes a little bit more speculation, but I think it's a useful bit of context. Now we don't know about every weapon system that's been shipped to Ukraine, but we do know about some. And even though the fighting in the Donbass was the heaviest for a significant period of time, not as much of that Western equipment was surfacing there as you might expect. Now obviously this is a very imprecise science. It's based on what sort of destroyed equipment the Russians are reporting in the Donbass, what we see the Ukrainians photographing and videoing themselves, but it certainly seemed to be the case that not enough Western SPGs or Western equipment or newly supplied tanks were appearing where the fighting was thickest. By contrast, these systems have been everywhere when we see images of the offensive in Kherson and Kharkiv. This would seem to suggest that Ukraine did take the time to re-equip certain units with newly arrived hardware, new T-72 tanks from Poland and the Czechs, Krabs and Panzerhaubitzen from Poland and Germany, M113s from the United States, and of course Bushmasters from Australia. It suggests that they maybe weren't feeding this new equipment into the Donbass meat grinder piecemeal, that they were willing to sacrifice under-equipped units in order to keep the line held there, in order to give them the time to build up capable mobile mechanized formations for use in these counteroffensive actions. Also notable is which brigades Ukraine is using in these offensives. As a matter of principle, I don't usually identify the individual units that I believe are involved in any particular offensive action, but some of Ukraine's best units are involved in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. I imagine this is something of a mystery for some of the pro-Russian English-speaking commentators on YouTube and elsewhere that insisted that the last remnants of the regular Ukrainian army had all been killed in the opening stages of the war and the Donbass grind. If that's the case, there are some zombies attacking Kharkiv Oblast right now. And maybe the Russian lies about Ukraine having biolabs weren't so wrong, if indeed they have found the ways to reanimate the dead. In any case, like I said, this is observation based on a limited pool of video and photographic evidence, plus what I was able to gather anecdotally from individuals that are in Ukraine. It may well turn out that the Ukrainian General Staff didn't prioritise these counterattacking units for resupply with Western equipment, but for now at least it seems possible that that's exactly what happened. In any case, that's enough speculation. Let's talk about what happened when the Kherson offensive went in. And here again, I couldn't recommend Colonel Reisner's video enough if you want the details of how the offensive actually played out, but here's the big picture. After day one of the Kherson offensive, the first day in which Ukrainian units seemed to go into action properly, Russian media was in a state of absolute elation. Ukraine had adopted a media blackout, not talking about progress on the ground, which meant that Russia had the full ability to control the media narrative. And the first claims that came out was that the offensive had failed on day one, that there were thousands of Ukrainian casualties, that there were dozens of destroyed armoured vehicles, and the attacks had been entirely repelled. Of course, despite having failed, the Kherson offensive seemed to continue, and slowly the Russian narrative started to change and become just slightly more panicked. After all, the Russian units that were defending against the Ukrainian attacks were at the other end of a very tenuous supply line. It was only a couple of pontoon bridges and ferries that were bringing supplies across, which meant that every round fired, every shell used, every Kazovac slot that had to be filled, was another demand being placed on an overstretched logistics system. Replacing anything, be it men or material, was going to become more difficult the more days passed. And so the question becomes, what was actually happening in Kherson? And what follows is at best triangulated speculation. Low to moderate confidence sort of stuff, based on a combination of factors like interviews with Ukrainian personnel, lost statistics that were coming out, reports from Ukrainian hospitals, and also commentary on Russian social media and from Russian mill bloggers. It does seem like the initial Ukrainian attacks didn't gain particularly much ground, but at the same time it doesn't seem that Ukrainians' initial attacks were intended to do so in most cases. They were probing or fixing actions. Territorial Defence Force units with relatively light equipment were involved in many cases, and they were attacking over ground that wasn't exactly favourable to attacking forces. Make no mistake, Ukrainian casualties seem to have been high. Certainly not as high as the Russians claim, but asymmetric. In this case, it does seem like the Ukrainians were losing more troops on the offense than the Russian defenders were losing. Then where opportunities for an actual offensive and exploitation were identified, it seems like the Ukrainians would bring up specialised mobile units. The Russians identify, for example, Belarusian volunteers, foreigners fighting for the Ukrainians, as having been used to storm one particular village. and we have video of other mechanized Ukrainian formations similarly being used in offensive operations. These attacks would take ground, but only very, very slowly, and Ukrainian casualties would be significant. Remember, a number of the defending Russian units were of a relatively high quality. Some of them were terrible. The Russians complain about artillery units that didn't provide fire because they were all drunk, but it seems like in at least some cases, the VDV lived up to that tradition of paratroopers everywhere, suffering extremely high casualties and fighting until the end to hold positions against overwhelming enemy force. Day after day, this Kherson offensive would push on, sometimes increasing in tempo, sometimes decreasing, but never stopping entirely. There are multiple interpretations to what is going on here. The first is that Kherson might simply have been a feint, an attempt to draw Russian forces to the south with no actual intention of succeeding. And as funny as it would be to declare it was just a feint, bro, after the Russian claims about the attack on Kyiv, I don't believe that to be the case. Instead, I wonder if the Kherson offensive, yes, while having the purpose of drawing Russian forces to the south, isn't also intended to succeed. Ukraine probably still wants the city of Kherson. It's still incredibly strategic and advantageous to have, but seizing it was always going to be difficult given the terrain involved. And so instead, I'd suggest that maybe Ukraine is fighting in a way that might be offensive to the sensibilities of some people in the West. You see, you can put stress on the Russian supply system in Kherson by cutting the bridges, but you're never going to reduce throughput to zero. There's always going to be some barges or some ferries, some way to get some supply across the river. The only way to run them out of supplies is to massively increase their consumption rate. You throttle throughput on the supply side, and then you increase demand for throughput. And as cynical as it sounds, the only way to drive up demand for shells, bullets, replacement vehicles, replacement men, or medevac slots, it's to embrace the attrition. It's to attack the enemy, to force him to defend, to force him to expend materiel, until eventually his supply situation becomes critical. While it is only speculation, it is certainly possible that the Ukrainians are attempting to run the Russian forces on the west bank of the river out of ammunition and supply so that eventually they run out and they are forced to surrender, retreat, or shatter in place. That would importantly give the Ukrainians an ability to liberate the city of Kherson without having to fight street by street, levelling the place in order to take it back. But whatever the case may be, while Kherson was raging on, the Ukrainians were preparing a second offensive on the other side of the country, up north in Kharkiv Oblast. And this offensive was to be everything that the Kherson offensive was not. Ukrainian political leadership said nothing about this sector. There was no telegraphing, there was no discussion on social media. It perhaps shouldn't have been a surprise that there was at least some offensive action in this area. I do follow a number of pro-Russian commentators and mill bloggers on the internet who noted the accumulation even under tight operational security conditions and suspected that an offensive was possible. But I would say that even in those cases, the scale of the offensive that was about to take place probably caught even them off guard. But regardless of what people were saying, tactical and operational surprise appears to have been achieved, and here is how the attack played out. Russian forces in this area had been relatively stripped down. If you look at the Kharkiv Oblast and the map on the top right, in that bulge of red on the bottom of the screen, you have the city of Izium. This is the major hub for Russian forces in the region. It's the wedge at which some of the best Russian units were being stationed, and they were pushing south in order to aid offensives into the Donbas. But to the north of that, near the top of the screen, there wasn't really much in the way of top-tier Russian units. In fact, there wasn't really much there at all. The Russians had stripped this sector down pretty bare. In any case, in the beginning, the Ukrainians launched an attack on the town of Balaklia, right on the border. It's the place where the little blue arrows are pointing. The Ukrainians attack Balaklia, and they find that it's defended by some conscript personnel from the Donbas proxies and some members of Rosgvardia, none of whom are particularly trained in any anti-tank weapons, and they don't exactly have a lot of heavy equipment to begin with. So as you can imagine, the resistance that they provide is relatively minimal. This constitutes a breakthrough. The town isn't entirely liberated straight away. There is how do you explain this in terms of Russian units to Western analogs? There's essentially SWAT team guys with RPGs, like special law enforcement, counterterrorism style personnel in Balaklia. They don't surrender immediately, but the town is surrounded, mostly taken, and then bypassed. This represents a breakthrough, and all of those Ukrainian mechanized and reserve forces that have been assembled start to pour through this and other axes of advance in order to exploit this initial breakthrough, and they start to move very bloody quickly. And when I say quickly, I mean it. This is the phase of the operation where you see the Ukrainians literally charging towns using Humvees, using speed, audacity, and suppressive fire in order to take positions with vehicles with basically no armoured protection. I have seen a lot of competing narratives in the media over just how large this initial attack was and how large the overall offensive is. After all, a number of Russian officials have come out and said that Ukraine is outnumbering Russian 8-1 in the counterattack. That was Vitaly Gunshev. Or that on Russian state TV, they're describing the Ukrainian attackers as a great horde that has descended upon the Kharkiv Oblast. But here's another figure from, again, pro-Russian sources. They say that Balaklia was overcome because the Ukrainians brought together a powerful tank spearhead that was impossible to resist, of 15 tanks. Now, make no mistake, 15 tanks in one place is probably a pretty intimidating sight. I certainly wouldn't want to go up against it, but keep that number in mind when we talk about the number of Russian vehicles that are abandoned later in this segment. Overall, the Ukrainians involved between 3 and 6 brigades in this counteroffensive action. That's not just a dispute between commentators, it's about how large a front you define as the counteroffensive and how you count up the various supporting units and whether you consider them collectively to represent a brigade or not. That estimate is also only really valid for the first day of the counteroffensive. After that point, as the counteroffensive expanded, more Ukrainian units would be drawn in. But it's not like there are no Russians in these positions. 1st Guards Tank Army is based at Izium, admittedly not with all of its components, but it's there. Overall, commentators say there are roughly 20,000 Russians in the Izium sector at this point. Russian 3rd Army Corps, which we'll see a little later in this story, and other reserve units also engage, and they collectively represent potentially tens of thousands of Russians. So it's not like the Ukrainians are some great horde outnumbering the Russian defenders. What they have is local superiority. They're able to overwhelm the relatively limited defences at the border at places like Balaklia, and then rush individual towns and positions, overcoming the confused Russian rear areas relatively quickly before they can consolidate into anything like a coherent defence. And that takes us to a discussion of what happens after the Ukrainians get around Balaklia and start storming into the Russian rear areas. I've seen some claims that once the Ukrainians got around Balaklia and started the exploitation phase, there were basically no Russian units behind the lines. Based on the sources that I can correlate, that doesn't seem to have been the case. There do seem to have been some Russian formations spread across these various towns and some form of localized reserve that had to be overcome in hard-fought battles. But overcome it was, and the exploitation continued. It didn't take very long for the word to start to get out and for panic to start to spread. After all, almost directly due east from the place where the Ukrainians broke through, there is eventually a city called Kupiansk. Kupiansk is important because it controls a railroad crossroad. If Kupiansk fell, there would be no way to supply all of those Russians down south in Izium by rail. Those Russians would find themselves encircled to the north, cut off from supplies, and bordered on their right by the Oskil River, with only a relatively narrow pathway back to safety. And as we all know, the best way to stop people panicking in an emergency is to tell them not to panic. That always goes well. And this led to one of the more humorous and ridiculous incidents in this whole damn war. Within less than 10 minutes of each other, multiple pro-Russian accounts on Telegram and other social media sources all started posting exactly the same message. It basically went like this: there is no panic. In Balaklia, there were mostly mobilised people. They mean referring to DNR LPR conscripts, basically saying it was their fault. There are now reserves going to Balaklia. Cannon and rocket artillery are working. Aviation is active. There is no talk of a deep breakthrough. The situation is as with the Nazi counteroffensive in the Kherson direction. Basically, the counteroffensive was only going anywhere because the Donbas conscripts don't know how to fight. Our reserves are at it, the artillery will do its job, and the Ukrainians are going to hit a brick wall. Now, this message miraculously seems to have only been about 50% bullshit. In Balaklia, there were indeed mostly mobilised DNR LNR conscripts, it seems, and indeed reserves were going to Balaklia. Aviation was active and Russian artillery was firing, although aviation would suffer some losses, but there was immense panic, and there was already a deep breakthrough. So, 50-50, you can decide if that represents a pass mark or not. And my next comments here are difficult to confirm because I only have pro-Russian sources available. The Ukrainians haven't issued after-action reports on the next stage of the operation yet. But as the pro-Russian military bloggers tell it, reserve units did then begin to be committed. Units from the 3rd Army Corps were photographed going into action and were shown on Russian TV. Units from what passed as the Operational Reserve were also sent into action. But the commentators suggest that they were sent in with limited preparation, that in some cases they were caught on the roads, ambushed and destroyed. The Russian reserve seemed to have been committed, piecemeal and ineffectively, consumed, destroyed or thrown back, with relatively limited to show from it in operational terms. And while we'll know more about that in the weeks and months to come, I'm sure, it does help explain what was happening next. The breakthrough was important, the Ukrainian commitment to the exploitation was important, but the panic and the failure of the counterattacks, likewise, probably made this a much more successful operation than it would have been if units had retained their cohesion, stood their ground, and only counterattacked when ready. But like I said, this is supposition based on information from only one side of the conflict. What is clear is that the Ukrainians raced forward. Partisans, special forces, deeper operations groups seem to have moved ahead of the Ukrainian spearheads, raising flags, causing chaos and generating confusion. The initial Russian narrative was that reinforcements were going in and the breakthrough would be contained. Russian TV showed their mighty Mi-26 helicopters, some of the largest heavy-lift helicopters ever built by humans, lifting armoured vehicles and reinforcements towards the Kupiansk area. At the same time, like I said, the Russians would show videos of units going in by land, units from 3rd Army Corps and other reserve formations, ostensibly driving to the front in order to stabilise it. But towns were falling at an incredible pace. Ukrainians were posting images of them standing outside the signs for cities like Kupiansk and in one case, even the city of Izium. They were raising flags, generating panic, and suddenly the Russian narrative switched. It was no longer the story that reinforcements were going to contain the breakthrough. And of course, there was no breakthrough at all initially as far as the Russian narrative went. No, instead now, this was a planned repositioning. And Russian units had always planned to leave most of Kharkiv Oblast and redeploy in order to reinforce the achievement of objectives in the Donbass. Now, I watch Russian spokesman Igor Konashenkov a lot, and I have to say, if nothing else, the man is a consummate professional, because he was able to stand up in front of a camera and honestly declare that all of this had been planned and that Russian forces were merely undergoing a planned repositioning. But at the same time, the evidence available does suggest that he was lying through his teeth. Planned repositionings usually don't involve abandoning huge stocks of operable ammunition or equipment to the enemy and running for your lives. Planned repositionings usually don't involve stories and videos of Russians stealing civilian clothes or bicycles to get away, or driving away on tanks so quickly that they end up crashing into trees. They usually don't involve leaving units behind to be rounded up and captured by the Ukrainians because you couldn't arrange for them to be withdrawn. It doesn't explain a lack of coordination, nor why various Russian commentators were saying that the units involved were very lucky to escape encirclement. On the bottom right there, Strelkov explains from his view the claimed escape of many of 1st Guards Tank Army's personnel from a near encirclement. He describes a situation where light Ukrainian mechanized units made it into the northern part of Izium, and then before the pocket was closed, most of 1st Guards Tank Army's personnel, if not its equipment, was able to flee through the remaining road east. So while I don't use these words lightly, the Russian movements here were not characteristic of a repositioning. They weren't characteristic of a planned tactical retreat. They were characteristic of a rout. They were characteristic of units that were threatened with encirclement and dropped everything, with a minimum of organisation in some cases, although not all of them do seem to have retained their organisation, and run as fast as they could in order to escape potential encirclement. And when I say they dropped everything and ran, I really mean it. The amount of equipment that has been left behind is astronomical. I was already preparing a video on the capture, repair and recovery of armoured vehicles with a guest appearance by the chieftain, but this last week has changed the statistics enough that I basically had to go back and redo all the numbers, so expect a captured equipment video incoming. It won't be pretty. For now, though, suffice to say that the most famous Ukrainian tank in existence, the T-80 Bunny, does look like it's about to get an extended family, courtesy of 1st Guards Tank Army. So at a high level, that's that. The offensive broke through a relatively weak part of the Russian line, exploited ruthlessly, defeated the Russian counterattacking reserves, caused a panic, and forced the Russians to retreat to the east bank of the Oskil River. And that's clearly a lot of territory retaken. The question becomes, though, In strategic terms, what is the impact of this operation? How much does it matter? Because having spent months talking about how every movement on the map isn't the be-all and end-all of the strategic situation, it'd be pretty hypocritical to turn around and just say, hey, the Ukrainians took territory, therefore their position has improved. So let's look at the impact in more detail. And the first point to make is that while the offensive is still ongoing, it has already changed the geographical positions in Ukraine. In particular, with the loss of Izium, there's no longer a threat vector for the Russians to push in from the north in order to put pressure and try and pinch off the rest of Donetsk Oblast. With Izium, the Russians could threaten Slovyansk and Kramatorsk from the north. They could put pressure on multiple parts of the front. With this change in territory, now the only way for the Russians to take the Donbass is to bash themselves headfirst into the most fortified areas, working through Seversk and Bakhmut, and then continuing west. To me, this is another point that is hard to square with the official Russian line that this was a repositioning designed to facilitate the accelerated liberation, in inverted commas, of Donetsk. Well, if your goal is to take Donetsk, then holding Izium was very useful. Instead now, whatever forces you've freed up, and it's unclear how many you've freed up because they've left a whole bunch of their equipment behind and they still have a large front to defend, so it's not clear how many of them could redeploy to Donetsk anyway, but whatever forces you can redeploy now only have one real vector to go in. They've got to fight through the teeth of Ukrainian defences, all the while dealing with a whole bunch of new vectors from which Ukraine can attack the LNR. And depending on how far the offensive goes before it finally culminates, well, that last point may not be beside the point, because while in some cases Ukrainian gains have been blown out of proportions, it may surprise you, but sometimes a person saying on Twitter that Ukraine has taken town with no visual evidence may in fact not be a reliable source of information. Even though that has sometimes been the case, there is general agreement on both sides that Ukraine continues to launch attacks and is still generally in the exploitation phase. For example, in an incident that is probably more embarrassing than militarily significant, although it does have some military utility, it turns out that, according to pro-Russian sources, so this is from the blogger Mers talking to Strelkov, the Ukrainian forces have crossed the Seversky Donetsk River. More than that, they've crossed it at Bilohorivka, which is the place you'll remember from all those images of destroyed Russian armoured vehicles from their failed river crossings. The Russians call it Belogorovka. So at more or less the same place that the Russians failed to ford the river multiple times, the Ukrainians have themselves recrossed the river in order to threaten Russian and associated DNR-LNR positions. Perhaps that explains why in their message there, Strelkov says no comment, all caps, and Mers says the armed forces of Ukraine, just don't laugh, successfully crossed the Seversky Donetsk near Belogorovka. According to the report, that puts the Ukrainian forces in the rear of the LNR forces that are defending Liman and on the flank of the LPR's 2nd Army Corps. So my point is not so much to predict how many more locations will fall, or indeed if the Russians will be able to reverse any of these gains with the counterattack. Rather, it is to just identify that even so far, the Kharkiv counteroffensive has dramatically improved the geographical position of the Ukrainian forces, both in the Kharkiv Oblast, but also in the context of the fighting in the Donbass. And then there's the material losses, because the Russians just don't know how to abandon territory without leaving half their heavy equipment behind as well. I don't use the following term lightly, but Russian material losses that have been visually confirmed so far in the Kharkiv Oblast are massive. They are reminiscent of the withdrawal from Kyiv more than any other stage of the fighting. And the numbers I have on screen there will be horrendously outdated by the time this video goes live. But when I was preparing this, after 7 days, we had visual confirmation of 102 tanks, 108 IFVs, 86 APCs, 66 artillery pieces, both self-propelled and non-self-propelled, and a total of 533 vehicles overall. Couple this with ammunition depots and supply dumps that have been taken intact, and here's the critical point here. Ukrainian losses may be non-negligible. In fact, they're probably very heavy in some cases. But a lot of this equipment that is being marked as lost isn't equipment that Ukraine has destroyed, it's stuff that the Russians have just left behind. And some of it appears to be in perfect working order. We already have videos of Ukrainians just jumping in the vehicles, starting them and driving them off. We have a farmer who recovered personally multiple T-80s that were in working condition, who then, of course, complained the Ukrainian army came and took all his tanks away because he wanted to use one. As he said, I just wanted to hoard one for myself. He was going to hand the rest over. But the point was the equipment was in perfect working order, which is absolutely incomprehensible and unforgivable if indeed this was a planned redeployment of forces. But perhaps even more important or more interesting than the quantity, and let's be clear, the quantity is extremely high. We're talking about visually confirmed a loss of tanks which is equivalent to about half of the entire French armoured force, to put this in perspective. But more interesting than the number of vehicles perhaps is the sort of vehicles that are being captured, because there's a whole bunch of upmarket things like T-80 and updated self-propelled artillery guns in the mix. And there aren't many units in the Russian army that use T-80. It's relatively distinctive. It's far outnumbered by things like T-72. And it helps confirm what many observers already basically knew. Elements of 1st Guard Tank Army, specifically parts of 4th Guards Tank Division, were at Izium. And I'm sure there are a lot of people listening now that don't understand exactly the significance of any of what I just said. So let's just take a moment and let's talk about 1st Guards Tank Army. Because I have received a barrage of comments and emails over the months that Russia has not committed its best troops, that the impressive, capable, prestigious units with the most up-to-date technology are all being held in reserve, that Russia has only used a fraction of its power so far, and any day now, if they choose, they will unleash those reserve units, the rest of their combat power, and overrun Ukraine. Well, again, like I said, let's talk for a moment about 1st Guards Tank Army. The history of 1st GTA and its two constituent divisions, the 4th Guards Tank Division and 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, goes back to World War II, the fighting on the Eastern Front against Germany, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. Ironically, 4th GTD won many of its honours in Ukraine, fighting to liberate parts of that territory from the Germans. The formation would remain one of the Army's high readiness formations throughout the Cold War, which meant it had most of its personnel most of the time, rather than being a reserve formation that was only intended to be staffed up in times of war. It was involved in the occupation of Germany, and it was involved in crushing dissent in what was then Czechoslovakia. It was briefly put in hiatus essentially after the fall of the Soviet Union, and then reconstituted in its current form as a Guards Tank Army of the Russian Federation, as opposed to the 1st Guards Tank Army of the Soviet Union. Pro-Russian commentators sometimes say that Putin's intention was to send the conscripts forward first, and then the real quality troops would come in behind. Well, 1st GTA are meant to be some of the best. These guys are based around Moscow. They're equipped with some of the best equipment and training that the Russian Federation can provide. A fact which ironically makes them quite simple to track in some cases. While it's difficult to read a unit insignia or a unit patch by satellite, it's pretty easy to identify the difference between a T-72 and a T-80. In any case, my point is, these are not some conscripts from a pub in Donetsk. These are not musicians from the conservatory. These are not conscripts with Moisen Nagants and Degtярevs from World War II. This is 1st Guards Tank Army. In the event of a war with NATO, these guys had two roles. In the event of an offensive action, this was the breakthrough unit. This was the unit that was meant to bust through NATO lines and break through and enable an exploitation. It was meant to crush through the best that Western Europe and the United States could pull together. On the defense, this was the counterattack unit. These were the guys who would go in after the initial defenses had been breached in order to stabilize the situation. Like I said, they were based around Moscow. This wasn't some frontier unit. This wasn't some second-tier operators using second-tier equipment. It was the best they bloody had. On paper, if the unit had been at full strength and it was up against a Ukrainian unit at full strength, it should have been able, on paper, to go head-on into the sort of Ukrainian brigades that were being used in this offensive action. Humvees with a Mardus on the roof are not meant to be a match for one of the most elite tank formations in the Russian army. And yet, the best version of the narrative that we have, or rather the most generous version of the narrative we have, because it's the version of the narrative that comes from the likes of Strelkov and Russian military bloggers, is that the division ran. They say that its personnel triumphantly managed to avoid encirclement in Izium through a relatively orderly escape. That's the version that they present. What we do know is that swaths, dozens of tanks, SPGs, command vehicles, troop transports, and ammunition dumps belonging to this unit, identifiable just by the sort of equipment it is in many cases, like the T-80s that are being captured didn't come from DNR conscripts. A lot of that stuff was just abandoned and left behind. These guys didn't take the time to disable their equipment. We know that because we see Ukrainians jumping in them and driving them. They didn't take the time to blow up the ammunition stocks. It doesn't take long to blow up a pile of ammunition, and yet the Ukrainians are recovering piles of ammunition. So whatever the version of events, the division left a lot of its equipment behind in Izium. It left behind some POWs too, reportedly. How many? Time will tell. We don't really know right now how many the Ukrainians are claimed to have killed or captured from First Guards Tank Army. But there's no way to spin this to say that it isn't at least a tactical defeat of what is meant to be one of Russia's best units. First Guards Tank already had a tough time earlier in the war. Trosnoyets was where it lost many of its tanks in the early engagements. Now it suffered very heavily again. And reconstituting a unit like this isn't simple. You can't just bring in some conscripts or some personnel that used to be in rear area services, pull some T-62s out of storage, and make up the numbers and still have as elite, as capable a unit as you did before. So those T-80s don't just represent a piece of equipment handed over to the Ukrainians, they represent damage to one of Russia's best remaining units, its most capable offensive and defensive formations. Because, a tank division with no tanks might find it difficult to execute on its tactical doctrine. In any case, my suggestion, the next time someone says that Russia is not using its good units or that it is saving them in reserve, ask them what units they're talking about, because if they mean the likes of the First Guards Tank Army, I don't think Ukraine's impressed. And I'll also note, I don't think it's just First Guards Tank Army that's been humiliated here. I think the Russian Air Force should take another big L. The Ukrainians have been able to launch a mechanized combined arms offensive in territory that is right up against the Russian border and not be suppressed by enemy air attack. Russia has the second largest combat air force in the world. It's got a massive fleet of helicopters, fighters, and ground attack aircraft. It has its air bases positioned bloody close to the engagement area. And it wasn't able to stop columns of Humvees and Bushmasters overrunning its positions. And yet it has managed to take some high-profile losses regardless. A pair of Sukhoi 30 SMs, and then in Crimea, a Su-25 SM crashed on takeoff. I try to be reserved with my language. And there are definitely explanations that go into this. The Russian explanation I found most commonly is the Ukrainians were pretty good at bringing up a whole bunch of air defense capabilities with them, rolling up books and tours and issuing a whole bunch of manpads. But from a strategic and investment perspective, if you have the second largest air force in the world, if the budget for that air force is greater than the entire military budget of your opponent, and you cannot establish air superiority or launch ground attack missions in territories against light mechanized forces on your border, well, I don't know. Any Air Force guys in the chat, feel free to rate that particular performance. But from an investment perspective, you have to wonder why half the aviation assets in the Russian military exist if they can't operate even under these conditions. At the start of this war, many observers expected that Russia would gain air superiority over Ukraine in a matter of days. Now it seems they couldn't stop a Bushmaster going to Belgorod. And then beyond those material components, the lessons that it teaches about Russian unit capabilities that forces us to revise our combat power estimates, there's also the moral element, because morale is just as much of an input into the fighting capability of a nation as the material elements are. Russian commentators are making big accusations and political pressure as a result of the counteroffensive in Kharkiv. I mean, there are recriminations to be had. No matter what the MOD says about the repositioning, the impression I get from most Russian commentators is they just don't buy it. No one thinks that this was a pre-planned, effective maneuver. They see it for what it is, a Ukrainian counteroffensive. And that strikes at the morale of a lot of the Russian units and the pro-Russian separatist forces that are there on the ground. But then, on the other side, there's the effect on the Ukrainian forces themselves. This is a big win for Ukraine, after a number of hard-fought battles that have mostly been on the defensive. It's a moral tonic. It supercharges their confidence, their belief in their ability to win, and their willingness to push on to the end. In my last summary video, I talked about how a majority of Ukrainians believe that their nation will be able to defeat Russia, drive them out of the country, and bring the war to a favourable conclusion. And that as long as that remains the case, there's really no way for Russia to force Ukraine to surrender. I can't imagine that this counteroffensive will do anything other than harden up that belief. Ukrainians will believe that they can win, and it will take an awful lot from the Russians to convince them otherwise. But there's also the international element to this, which is arguably more important. In many ways, this is a critical time in the international narrative for Ukraine. The United States is going into an election. Maybe the Russians believe that the United States will be distracted from the Ukraine issue. Europe is facing a really uncomfortable winter, and that's putting it nicely. So if there was ever a time when foreign powers might be convinced to look away, to reduce their support, to suggest some sort of compromise solution to the crisis, this was going to be the window because of those extraneous factors putting pressure on them. And the narrative that Russian InfoWar has tried to push, married with that, based on what I see coming out of their commentators, is the idea of Russian victory as an inevitability. The argument that Russian victory in Ukraine is inevitable. Russia is too strong, Russia is too powerful. So all supplying Ukraine does, according to this argument, is prolong the suffering, prolong the crisis, because nothing can actually change the outcome. I think this counteroffensive probably takes most of those narratives and puts them to bed. The idea of Russian victory, military victory as an inevitability, has probably been taken out back behind the barn and put out of its misery. It's very hard for a commentator to look at images of flags going up in liberated towns, Zelensky visiting Izium, and Ukrainians tractoring away the T-80s of 4th Guards Tank Division and make the argument that, yeah, Russia is inevitably going to win this conflict. In America, I think this offensive has the potential to capture attention and, more importantly, show that the Ukrainians are willing to fight. This is just supposition, but I feel like many Americans were burned by the effort that went into the Afghan National Army, only for the whole thing to disintegrate the moment the Americans left. There was fear, genuine fear, based on the survey data that I've seen, that corruption would lead to equipment being misappropriated or the Ukrainian army would collapse and it would all fall into the hands of the Russians. Well, the Ukrainians have proved that they're willing to fight. They're capable of fighting, they're willing to win. And Americans are a lot more willing to provide equipment to someone that is actually willing to put in the hard yards and fight the fight. And politically for Europeans, it becomes very hard to pull support from Ukrainians, well, right after they've scored a massive victory. I mean, it cannot be a coincidence that the German Chancellor calls Vladimir Putin soon after this counteroffensive and says that the basis for any ceasefire should be the Russian withdrawal from Ukraine as a prerequisite. Whether you're talking about Western media sources, Russian online commentators, Russian state TV, or media in non-aligned states like India, it has taken less than 2 weeks for this offensive to fundamentally change the character of the narrative that we are seeing, and that can only favour Ukraine. It's easier to ask for equipment from allies when they think they're backing a winner. It's easier to ask a people to volunteer for military service when they're proud of what the army is accomplishing. And for that reason, maybe the flags being raised in Kharkiv Oblast are as valuable as the tanks that are being captured. In Russia, the counteroffensive has clearly made things increasingly politically and socially uncomfortable. It is getting harder and harder to maintain the official line that the special military operation, as they call it, is all going according to plan. Because if it is going according to plan, inevitably some Russians are going to ask the question, who on earth came up with a plan which involves us getting our asses kicked out of Kharkiv Oblast more than 6 months into the war and becoming Ukraine's primary armoured vehicle supplier in the process? The Kremlin's now in the uncomfortable position of having to take flak from two sides at once. On one side, you have the ultranationalists, the like of Strelkov, who have been arguing from the beginning that Russia should call this a war, declare general mobilization, and go and crush Ukraine. On the other side, you've got an anti-war flank, usually represented in places like local government, who complain the Kremlin never should have started the war in the first place. Keep in mind that complaining in Russia is a pretty brave thing to do. And then, of course, in the middle, I'd argue you have the silent flank, which is the regular population, whose view of the whole thing is that they really want to be left out of it. Putin's invested a lot of effort over a lot of years depoliticizing the general population. They say on surveys that they're generally supportive of the special military operation, as they call it, but none of them are exactly racing to volunteer. Russia is a country of more than 144 million people that finds itself recruiting openly from the homeless, prisons, the elderly and the disabled in order to make up numbers in its military. That despite the fact that they are offering extremely generous pay and sign-on bonuses, that to me says that the general population isn't particularly enthused with the idea of going to war. Otherwise, they would be drowning in recruits. And so the bulk of the Russian population probably takes the view, as far as the Kremlin is concerned, that they really don't care what happens as long as no one tries to mobilize them or their children for war, which is exactly what the ultranationalists and right-wingers are calling for. But I use the word uncomfortable very deliberately. There's a lot of news articles out there right now saying that we should prepare for the fall of the Russian Federation, that this is the straw that will break the camel's back somehow. For my part, I find a collapse in the short term extremely unlikely. The Russian regime is heavily dug in, most of the population is depoliticized and aren't really feeling the pain yet, and unless they're mobilized, they won't feel the pain. Putin has a very tight control over the security apparatus and the military, and in the Russian system, there is always the opportunity to find scapegoats. Scapegoats will no doubt be found for what has happened in Kharkiv. They will be removed, and the damage will be partially minimized. The Russians have lost most of Kharkiv Oblast, not the suburbs of Moscow, and indeed some historical Russian regimes have survived losing even that. I won't pretend to predict what happens in the black box of Kremlin politics. I can accept this will absolutely create additional pressure for something to change, but I do not think this means the inevitable breakup of the Russian Federation. What it probably does mean, however, is the acceleration of Russia's ever-growing military manpower problem. Most of the questions I get are about Russian military equipment, losses, statistics, analysis, logistics, etc. That makes a certain kind of sense given my skill set. But I'd argue the biggest problem facing the Russian military, from relatively early in this conflict and even more so now, is the shortage of trained, capable military manpower. It has become fashionable in some circles to laugh or demean the overall quality of the Russian military. And certainly the overall performance of the institution has underperformed most of the projections the West had about how the Russian army would perform in a conflict like this one. But that doesn't mean there are no formations in the Russian army that have significant combat power. From the start, because Russia wasn't able to take its conscript personnel or stand up to a wartime standing, it suffered a shortage of, for example, trained infantry. I've talked about this before. And the result of that is that Russia has leaned heavily at every stage on its primarily contract, full-time, capable and elite units. There is a fantastic thread by Rob Lee on Twitter, and there's some great work that has been done by the BBC in Russia looking at obituaries and funerals in Russia to identify those who have fallen in Ukraine, who have been officially acknowledged in some way or another. If you look at that thread, you notice a theme very, very quickly. You see a lot of officers and men of units like the VDV and also of the naval infantry. The Russian paratroopers were at the tip of the spear at Kyiv. They're holding ground now in Kherson. The naval infantry, generally acknowledged by outside observers to be some of the best performing infantry forces in the Russian army in this conflict, these units have suffered heavy casualties. They have been called on time and time again to do what the rest of the army cannot do, and they have suffered for it. And at the same time, Russia has done a very bad job of replacing its losses like for like. It's used halfway measures time and time again and consumed its mobilisation base. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's called up those volunteers that are willing to serve, given them equipment, but given them only limited training, put them in their own units and sent them into combat. That's a recipe for getting men killed and equipment destroyed. If they genuinely followed through on stripping their training units in order to create new BTGs, well then they've just diminished their ability to train new manpower in the future. And this continued practice of hacking together new units, giving them a minimum of training and freshly issued equipment, is just a great way of burning out personnel and equipment with very limited return. And then, of course, there's 4th Guards Tank Division, which had a bad time at Trosnoyets early in the war and has now had a bad time at Izium. Now, I want to stress here, the loss of experienced manpower is not a uniquely Russian problem. The Ukrainians have suffered heavy losses in this war, many of them amongst their more capable units. The difference is in the pipeline. The difference is in the replacements. Ukraine has a constant influx of volunteers. It has foreign powers that are offering to give them training courses, and also it brings, in many cases, volunteers and new recruits into existing units so that they can learn from experienced personnel, rather than grouping them all together, giving them 7 days training, an AK, and sending them to the front. More seriously, Russians complain that many of these newly formed units don't contain things like communication specialists to operate their radios and communicate with fire support elements and other units. That makes sense. If you're recruiting from a prison ward or a homeless shelter, you're not likely to get many IT experts or mechanics or technicians, people to maintain or use your more complex equipment. Ukraine has an ability to bring in those specialist skills and build functional and effective units to a much greater extent than Russia seems to. And it's for that reason I would argue that whatever casualties have been suffered at Kherson or Kharkiv, if they are among these more experienced units, I expect Russia is going to feel that far more than Ukraine does. But I've already talked for too long, so let's talk about what this offensive means and the ongoing offensive in Kherson means for the war to come. And the first thing to say is that this isn't over yet. In Kharkiv, battles are ongoing. There's heavy fighting for places like Liman at the time of recording, for example, and where the lines sit after all the offensive actions are culminated and any Russian counteroffensives have played out, that is still ultimately uncertain. The Kherson direction also remains very active. The strategy seems to be to continue to grind, drive up the supply consumption of the Russian units until eventually they break. The Russians now find themselves in a difficult position because the Ukrainians can move troops between the Kharkiv front, the Donetsk front, and the Kherson front far faster than Russians can move them from, say, the Kharkiv front to Kherson back and forth, especially when you involve Kherson because you're limited to ferries and pontoon crossings and things like that. That means that to an extent, Ukraine can pick and choose where it puts the focus, increasing or decreasing the heat as necessary. At the same time, it's worth pointing out that the Russians have continued to attack in the Donbas throughout this whole thing. Wagner is still trying to fight their way towards Bakhmut. And depending on which sources you follow, there may be potentials for even further counterattacks to play out still. I've got a post from Strelkov there in the bottom right. Remember, he's the pro-Russian one who's always calling for mobilization. He's suggesting that there are still uncommitted Ukrainian reserves in the south, and they may launch an offensive in the next week or two in one of multiple directions, potentially towards Mariupol or potentially a counteroffensive in the Donbas. So while I've done my best to capture the action over the last several weeks, there's almost certainly more to come. In the weeks and months to come, though, there will be pressures for both sides to slow down, not just because they burn out their combat potential or outrun their logistics. It's going to be because of the weather. In a couple of weeks, Ukraine will start to get muddier and muddier. Certainly not as muddy as it was when the Russians invaded. Remember the dumb shit plan that involved invading with a mechanized force during mud season? Recall that for a moment. It'll get muddy, and then it's going to get very bloody cold. Well, cold by Australian standards in any case. But mud and then the onset of winter doesn't necessarily mean the end of offensive operations. History in this part of the world is replete with winter offensives, and it's not like the Ukrainians and the Russians are unfamiliar with those conditions. But last mile resupply and other sustainment challenges will get worse. And so, all else being equal, you would expect there to be downward pressure on the overall level of offensive activity. All else being equal, winter is likely to be a hard time for the civilian population, but may be an opportunity for the military on both sides to at least partially take a break. And in military terms at least, the question of who is going to win remains unanswered. That's because you can hypothetically draw outcomes on any side of the spectrum. And of course it depends on how you're defining winning, because there's no one single agent here who gets to be the umpire to decide who's won. To put it in more concrete terms, for example, there is still a scenario in which the Ukrainian military is defeated. It's a strange scenario which involves the West pulling all of its support from Ukraine so that Ukraine runs out of material and goes bankrupt, at the same time as Russia managed to get its act together, adjust its doctrine, recruit new troops, reconstitute itself, and then launch a new offensive in 2023. Unlikely, but hypothetically possible. On the other extreme, it's possible that Ukraine develops enough military power to eventually throw Russian forces out of its territory. And as long as all of those outcomes are still technically in play, whatever the probability may be, then we can't say for sure who will win in a military sense. Kharkiv only illustrates that the latter is a possibility, that Ukraine can reclaim ground. It doesn't prove that it is inevitable that Ukraine will reclaim all of its ground. But I'm sure there are some people who regard that as an accurate but cop-out answer nonetheless. So let's close out by looking at some of the trends, the inputs and pressures that might suggest which way this war is likely to go. Because while predicting the future is really, really hard, identifying current trends is somewhat simpler and more objective. And so I come back to some of those inputs into a nation's warfighting potential that I discussed at the start. Manpower, materiel, method, morale, and intelligence. In manpower, I think it's fair to say the Ukrainians now likely have superiority. They probably have more troops overall available to them than the Russians do in combat-ready condition. Certainly they have local superiority in the Kharkiv and Kherson Oblasts. The trend is also pro-Ukraine. The training program to recruit and train new Ukrainians to NATO standards in NATO countries is increasing in scale and generating thousands of new recruits. Russia has the potential on paper to overpower Ukrainian manpower reserves, but there's no sign of the political and social will to do so far. In material terms, the Russians probably still do have superiority. They still have more equipment, more systems, more ammunition, more firepower in total. Ukraine doesn't have an air force to match the Russian one. Ukraine does not have long-range munitions. There's a range of material capabilities the Russians have, the Ukrainians don't. Which way the trend goes over time really depends on one thing: how many supplies are Western countries willing to send the Ukrainians in order to increase their capabilities. In terms of tactics and methods, I think the Ukrainians have shown that they are more capable multiple times, and it's unknown whether or not the Russians will eventually become better at this. I don't think morale is even close. I think Russian forces are generally demoralized. That doesn't mean they're all about to break and rebel and go home, but certainly the Ukrainian forces are more energized than they would have been in months, and the trend is probably upwards for Ukraine off the back of the recent counterattack. I think the memory of this one will last them a good long while. And then finally, Ukraine has shown a superior intelligence capability in terms of locating Russian positions and assets, partly because of their indigenous capabilities and partly because of intelligence sharing from other countries. So to rehash an old argument, the Ukrainians have manpower but no metal, and the Russians have metal but no manpower. So what we may see signs of now is both sides trying to make up for their weaknesses over winter. For Ukraine, it's about making up that material gap, bringing in new capabilities, training on them, and bringing them online in time for new offensives in 2023. For Russia, meanwhile, they have to find a politically and socially acceptable way to solve their manpower problem. Personally, I am pessimistic on Russian chances there, at least within the scope of the strategies they have used so far. It'll take a while for us to understand exactly what 3rd Army Corps did during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, but it does seem like this combination of volunteer units that was pulled together, if it was sent in at all, bounced off the Ukrainians to limited effect. It may just turn out to be that blokes in their 50s with back issues and 7 days of military training do not stormtroopers make. And of course, that will be coupled with the industrial challenges of trying to mobilise an economy for war, while also being under heavy international sanctions and wanting to shield the public from any financial fallout. And there's another pernicious problem here that I haven't seen talked about that much. Russia isn't at war, which means it cannot compel people to fight, which means people are there for the duration of their contracts. All these volunteer units, the prisoners, the murderers, the homeless, the volunteers from the economically depressed areas, I could throw up some advertisements, but most of them were asked to sign contracts for 6 months around the June-July period. Some of them are still signing on now, but most of them were signing up around June-July. That means early next year their contracts are up. The prisoners are hypothetically free, willing to go, not required to be there. The volunteer units can go home. A lot of the contracts that are in the Russian army themselves, they're on fixed-term contracts. Legally, technically, a lot of those troops will have the choice over time. Every month that passes, more of them will have the choice to go home. And there's a question over how many are really taking up volunteer contract service at the moment. I don't mean to cause any trauma to any American veterans that are listening, but you have to imagine that by the sort of November, December, January period, the Russians are going to have a bit of a choice regarding all these people who have signed on for 6 months. Do they bring in something like a stop-loss program to prevent people leaving the military even though their contracts or periods of service are up? And if not, how do they make up for the sudden decrease in manpower? It doesn't really matter how many T-62s you drag out of boneyard storage if no one's available and willing to drive the damn things. Ukraine, meanwhile, wants to build up the capacity to launch more counteroffensives in 2023. And I don't need to guess what equipment or opine what equipment the Ukrainian army needs in order to do this. I can lean on a much more qualified source. On the 7th of September, General Zaluzhny wrote an article on the prospects for a Ukrainian military offensive in 2023, set out the Ukrainian army's view and what it thought it needed in order to drive the Russians out next year. I'll link the article for those of you who want to read it, but the long and short of it is this. The Ukrainians want 10 to 20 new manoeuvre brigades equipped to NATO standards. To put that into perspective, they used about 5 brigades in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. But to do that, that means they need enough infantry fighting vehicles, personnel carriers, tanks and support vehicles in order to staff those formations to a standard better than stuff from the 1960s or captured from the Russians. The Europeans can certainly help. Martyrs and Leopards from Germany would be great, and France shouldn't escape scrutiny either. But realistically, the United States is the only actor that can fill that shopping list. In some ways, the American military is kind of like the Russian one. America has very deep heavy equipment reserves, ranging from recently retired Marine Corps tanks to thousands of older Bradleys, kept in reserve for spare parts and a very, very, very rainy day. A lot of that stored material would probably be considered junk by many in the United States Armed Forces. It would probably be a political scandal if people were ever sent into battle with the stuff. But on the battlefields of Ukraine up against Russian equipment, especially the stuff that's being pulled out of Russian deep storage, it would actually be incredibly modern and potentially very effective. The logistical challenges involved would be enormous, the training burden would be extensive. But if you're unwilling to hand over active duty materiel, that's your option. And if the Russians are able to reactivate their equipment from deep storage, it's difficult to believe the United States military couldn't accomplish the same. There's also the question of long-range fire capabilities. The Ukrainians point out that as long as the Russians have munitions capable of reaching out 2,000 kilometres and they can only reach 80-85 kilometres in response, then their options are going to be exceptionally limited. The Russians can always pull back and continue to bombard them from afar. Likewise, everyone's favourite high-profile logistical targets, like bases in Crimea or a certain bridge, will probably remain out of Ukrainian reach. To that end, they're asking for long-range fire systems. They specifically identify ATACMS, the MGM-140, which is a long-range tactical ballistic missile system that can be fired from the M270 and HIMARS, as one of the answers to this problem. America has so far been reluctant to provide this weapon system because it could hypothetically be used to strike into Russia, even though Ukraine promises not to use it as such. In the event America still doesn't want to provide these missiles, perhaps there's an opportunity to use them as leverage, making clear that if Russia does, for example, escalate its attacks on critical civilian infrastructure, as it has threatened to do, then ATACMS and similar weapons will be supplied to Ukraine en masse in response. And finally, in other documents, Ukraine asks for a way to address the power of Russian air and missile attacks. That means more surface-to-air missile systems, that means Western standard aircraft for themselves, and it means munitions for those aircraft. The HARM missile has made a tremendous difference. The introduction of something like F-16 would make much more. As for whether any of this will be politically acceptable to the American people, I can only posit one particular point when it comes to communication. If you value all the equipment at however much the US government paid for it initially, and then say we're spending oodles of billions of equipment to Ukraine, then the public might respond one way. If you tell them we're shipping a whole bunch of stuff from deep storage that we would never use ourselves again and we're going to throw away eventually anyway, well then the response is likely to be somewhat different. That's not to say that Ukraine not getting all the equipment it asks for necessarily means it's going to lose. Instead, what I'm talking about is, and what the Ukrainians are talking about, from a mathematical perspective, is about optimizing the ratio between manpower and materiel when it comes to generating combat power. If you have less materiel, if you have worse weapons, worse vehicles, then you're going to have to apply more people and suffer more casualties in order to do the same amount of work, in order to generate the same amount of combat power. That suggests that any shortfall in resupply will lead to an increase in Ukrainian casualties and vice versa. Ultimately, it's not my place to say what should go one way or the other. All I can do is identify what the Ukrainians are saying they need and the effect that it will likely have. But military materiel and national industrial capability are the last remaining area of serious Russian advantage over their Ukrainian opponent. And the West does have the capability to reverse that imbalance if it chooses to. It won't be quick and it won't be cheap, but given enough time and resources, it can probably be done. So after all that, I thought I'd close out with some final thoughts. After all, this video was originally going to be the 6-month summary, so it makes sense to be a little bit reflective. We knew in the West that Ukraine would begin this war with a deficit in materiel and manpower. Its methods and its morale were unknown. The opening stage of the war clarified that position. It showed that Ukrainians were willing to fight, and the net pressures on the overall strategic balance have been upwards on Ukrainian manpower and materiel for some time. As Russian equipment and manpower burns down and Ukraine receives more assistance and levies more soldiers, well, there's a potential for the overall balance of power to inflect, to the point where in some areas of Ukraine, Ukrainian armed forces are probably already more powerful on balance than their Russian opponent. That doesn't mean the trend has to continue forever inevitably. There's a lot of things that could cause the trends to reverse. The West pulling support, or Russia drastically changing the way it does business. But at the same time, the acceleration of pro-Ukrainian trends is also possible. It is possible that equipment supplies increase in frequency and that Russian resources burn down at a greater rate, as they did during the Kharkiv offensive. But this is all still mathematical, strategic, big picture, and I know that's why a lot of you come to this channel. But forgive and indulge me for a moment when I talk about the personal. I believe that professionally there has to be a distinction between your own values and your analysis. If you let your analysis be steered by your personal views or what you want to happen, then you are a shit analyst. You end up telling your president that if he invades Ukraine, everyone will join his side, and also the Ukrainian government are a bunch of Nazis. You are useless at your job at that point. And on that note, I stand by my record so far. I think most of my predictions have held up very, very well, including the ones that were made early on in March. But at a personal level, I have to admit that some of these liberation videos that are coming out of Kharkiv, Kherson, they do get to me a bit. If you are on Twitter or Telegram, you will see these videos of Ukrainian troops, whether it was in April or now, going into towns that have been held by the Russians. You will see the local population, usually at that point the elderly and women, because men obviously would have left or been filtered out, coming out to, generally speaking, welcome their liberators. These women, they dress like my baka, my grandmother. They sound like my baka. When the first thing they do when soldiers turn up is offer them to come inside for, I'm pretty sure I got the word right, the Ukrainian equivalent, they offer them pancakes, palichinka in Croatian. Very different word in Russian and Ukrainian, but I got the gist. That's exactly, frankly, that's exactly what my baka would do in that situation. And I disclose that bias so that you're very aware of it as I make the following point. These videos matter, and the reception these troops are getting generally matters. Yes, there are pro-Russian collaborators and whatnot that fled these areas, but for the most part, the locals have greeted them this way. This is a part of Ukraine. When they greet them, they are speaking Russian. They are not speaking Ukrainian in most cases. These ladies are speaking Russian. In the pro-Russian narrative before this conflict, this was meant to be one of the pro-Russian areas. This is an area full of Russian language speakers who are being oppressed by the Ukrainians. These are the people who are meant to be most closely on the Russian side. So if the Kremlin has lost the people, if the Kremlin has lost the grandmothers of Kharkov, then how could it ever hope to win the rest of the country? Where are the shreds of theoretical brotherhood that are meant to sustain a Russian occupation or a Russian annexation or a Russian-backed puppet regime in these areas? Where is it? These women don't have combat power. Short of throwing a jar of pickles at a drone, they're not really going to do any damage to anyone. But their opinions, their views, these reactions confirm that the political and social side of Russia's war aims is untenable. The Russian army can do what it likes. The Russian army can take what ground it wants. But what does it say when the Russian-speaking population in the eastern parts of Ukraine celebrate the return of the Ukrainian military and the eviction of the Russians? Again, not a universal reaction, but certainly the overwhelming one, it seems. And I think it ties into one of the great differences between Russia and Ukraine in this fight. The degree of political and social mobilization, not just military mobilization. When we talk about mobilization, we can get stuck on the mechanical process of doing so. How quickly can you take in inductees? How quickly can you deploy them by train? How quickly can you train them? What I'm talking about here is the mobilization of the society. Leaving foreign assistance to a side for a moment, Russia has greater resources than Ukraine. Winter in Ukraine for civilians will be a lot harder than the winter for the well-to-do in Moscow. But there's an asymmetry of political mobilization, and that impacts how much suffering the people of a country are willing to endure and how much of their resources they're willing to dedicate, to convert into combat power, whether that be volunteering for military service or whether that being enduring hardship without complaint. Many elements of the Russian plan for military intervention in Ukraine were dumb, and I think history will back that assessment up. The initial offensive plan was dumb as shit in terms of the assumptions that it was built on. The idea that you could thunder run light units around population centres and overthrow the Ukrainian government with a minimum of effort. But as a strategic blunder, I think it pales in comparison to beginning this war by standing up and saying that Ukraine as a country does not and should not exist. Denying a people's culture, denying a people's language, denying a people's identity, and calling their nation a Bolshevik construct. I'm not sure I can think of any greater way in order to mobilise resistance amongst even those people who would, in the absence of such actions, have been at least partially favourable to Russia. It is total war language married with limited war methods. And that dichotomy, I would argue, weighs on Russian military capability and Russian prospects in the country as heavily as any institutional crisis or logistical limitation. In conclusion, I think the outcomes at Kharkiv from the counteroffensive were unexpected but understandable. as a culmination of a long-term strategy, the shifting balance of combat power inputs, so manpower, materiel, method, intelligence, etc., as well as the unexpected tactical and operational land of Ukrainian troops at the local level. I think it's important not to overlearn the lessons, the idea that Russian combat power is insignificant. I think Russian combat power in many units remains significant, and there's potential for them to launch some counterattacks further down the road. The battlefield situation remains very fluid. Who knows what will happen next week or the week after? We still have several weeks before mud starts to be any issue at all, and then winter comes later on. But there is a big question over winter developments and which side will be more successful in getting opportunities to regenerate or expand its combat power over that period of time. There is an opportunity to inflect the conflict over the winter, I think, to get to the point where the Ukrainians are unambiguously stronger in certain sectors than the Russians are. But really that depends on material support from the West. I will say, though, that regardless of which way the military conflict goes in the future, Russian political objectives have been thoroughly undermined. The image of invincibility has been shattered, and it's evident that people in occupied areas who they would have hoped would be pro-Russian have instead welcomed back Ukrainian forces by and large. That's probably going to sting the Russians just as much as the loss of all of those armoured vehicles at Izium. Alright, channel update to close out. This has been the longest video ever, and I apologise for the delay in getting it to you. I was about to release the 6-month update, which is what a lot of this video's material came from. Then the Kharkiv offensive played out, and as you can imagine, I had to stop and clarify the situation first to incorporate it. A big thanks to all of you who acted as sources, who helped me clarify some of this information. I genuinely appreciate it. I'll also apologise for a lack of progress on things like Discord and translation this week. The absolute priority was getting this video rebuilt and ready for release. Next week's video will be on captured Russian equipment and its significance, and I cannot think of a more relevant topic given the success of the Kharkiv offensive. I've had to rewrite a considerable amount of its content given recent days, so do look forward to that one. A final thank you to all for your patience. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next week.